Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a delight for me to be here in Ankara. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's the first time in Ankara, and it's great to see the development of a city of a size of half the size of the place I live in London, but an awful lot bigger than I'd anticipated when I arrived last night. So thank you for the welcome. I wear a number of hats. One of my hats is to be involved heavily in terms of the development of cities in Europe. I'm also working in India, in America, and various other places, and I'd like to share with you some views in terms of what I see happening in cities. Let me just go back a slide if I could. So a few points I'd like to bring out here for you in my presentation. The first is to set the context. We live in a world which is getting flooded with people, and that has an enormous effect. So in our daily lives, we get up in the morning and do a good job, but sometimes forget what's happening in the longer term. So I'd like to set the context. I'd then like to look at the market, specifically the smart cities market, how we're using technology and digitization to change the way that urbanization is happening. And that market is one where nobody can hide from change. The third point, and the very important point, is that of government. So what is the role of government to actually make the market work effectively? And this is something which countries and regions around the world are really struggling with. Taking that national level then to city level, I'd like to touch on what I see happening in terms of leadership of cities. And from there to a topic 20 years ago that I ran away from in terms of standardization, but one which is absolutely vital to make sure that our cities will function properly. So I'd like to touch on what the standardization community is trying to do to actually help the market develop and evolve. And from that point to how do you actually make things happen? So two messages. One is, what is it that we can do to make cities ready for the change, to help them go through that transformational process, particularly the small and medium cities where actually the majority of people live. And then I'd like to end with one very simple, very specific example, one of 5 things that I think that every city mayor should be doing. So let me start with that. But let me start first by asking you a question. So this is not the stadiums of football, and I know that you love it in this country. By the way, I prefer rugby personally. But if I was to put in the middle of this stadium a drop of water at noon on a Saturday, and it doubled in volume every minute, at what point would the stadium overflow? Now, some would say, well, maybe on Monday morning. Many would get it wrong. So let's look at the answer of that. At 12:49, the stadium will overflow. Now, for the mathematicians in the room, that makes total sense. Now, let me ask you the next question. At which point is that stadium 95% empty? 95% empty. At 12:45. Now, the message here is we live in an exponential world. In your lifetime and in my lifetime, the world's population will treble. Now, that's something you don't wake up every morning and think about, but actually it has an enormous effect on everything, on energy consumption, on fish population. So it's quite useful to reflect sometimes on these very simple facts. Now, let's make that, instead of football, human. I'm going to show you a series of pictures of the top 20 cities in the world. And you can see in the bottom right the sort of scale and size of the blobs. So that's the picture as it was in 2010. And as we move from 2010 to 2025, we're shifting south and we're shifting east. And as we move from 2025 to 2050, we're shifting again, and the cities are becoming larger. Now, obviously, forecasting is always wrong, but as we shift to 2075, there's a significant change and likewise in 2100. Now, UN forecasts in terms of the population of the world, I always thought we estimated it at 7 million. When I was a kid, that was the number. Then it became 9 million. By the way, the large number, the high-level forecast, is 30 billion people in this world. So that's where the population is going to shift, and it's going to grow. And that is in one lifetime, a bit more perhaps. But the implications of that are huge. It's transformational. There is no question about it. So for us to just continue to do our daily lives and our daily work is insufficient. We have to consider what role we play, what role you play in a transformational agenda. Now, turning to the market, if I look specifically at how digitization, how smart cities has emerged over the last decade or so, it has been one of technology-led and industry-driven. The discussion has been technology will change everything. And that's not really the case. The issues are very much deeper. The issues are about people. So we need to shift from a position which is technology-led and industry-driven to a position which is city needs-led and demand-driven. That's a 180-degree shift. And that's what we are going through right now, and that's what we need to do. So that shift is palpable and is very, very important. Now, when I say city needs-led, I do not mean city-led. What do I mean the distinction between those two things? A city, all cities are individuals. By the way, all of us are individuals, but there's an awful lot of common things. In fact, 99.9% of us is pretty common. So we need to think about what are the common needs of cities and address designs to those common needs. And if we can address designs to the common needs, then we can help accelerate the transformational process. So on the left and right-hand side of that diagram are two parts of the market. The cities part of the market, industries part of the market. Industry are struggling to figure out what cities are. They are complicated. The difference between shareholder value and stakeholder value and public value is enormous. So that's a learning that industry doesn't really get. Cities are necessarily organisms. They are complex. Cities are naturally like that. People complain about that. That's life. That's the way that they are. Human beings are complicated. Industry needs to learn that. So there's a lot in the industry side which is necessary to understand how to do business effectively with cities. In the same way, cities also need to change. Cities need to respect the fact that though they are individuals, there's a lot of commonality. And so they need to actually figure out how to address that commonality and work together collaboratively. There are also capacity constraints in cities, particularly the small and medium-sized cities, which is very important for us to deal with. So just those two parts of the market are complex. There's a missing ingredient. The missing ingredient is money. Public funds are insufficient to manage that transformational process, which means we need to access commercial funds. Banks, investors are very cautious if they don't see a return stream. So how can we use public funds to stimulate the pulling in of industry and commercial funds into the market? So investors need to actually be more prepared to engage with the complexity of cities and understand cities and work with them better. So there's change in all of those three areas, but the most important change isn't there. The most important change is with you and with me and with us as society. We need to take a personal interest and a personal accountability for what we do. 5 years ago, waste, I couldn't care less, it went in one bin, and now I'm passionate about figuring out which pieces go in which particular bin. That's a change between the years. That's a change of society. And that's the most fundamental change, which is for society to take an accountability, to take an interest, to develop trust with cities. And given the map I've shown you in terms of the scale of cities, the urbanization that's happening, it's really important that between City Hall, that respects public value, and people, there's a trust equation which is built to make that work. So in terms of the market, It's difficult, it's complicated, and it's change all around. An exponential world, growing urbanization, and a massive change in terms of the market. So how do we tackle that? So here's an example. In Europe, there are 27 countries. It might change with Brexit, unfortunately. But for the time being anyway. 27 countries, lots of microphones, lots of headphones. How do you get consensus? It's very, very difficult. So the Europeans set up something called the European Innovation Partnership for Smart Cities and Communities. And it was an initiative to actually drive from the bottom up, to get industry and to get cities together. And there was one missing ingredient for me, which was nations. What is the role of government to make cities function better? Particularly their role to support small and medium cities. So we launched something called the Six Nations Smart Cities Forum. And the Commission said, but we can't do that. We have to have 27 people in the room. And they all need to agree. And I said, you can't do that. I can. So we got the 6 largest or most progressive countries in Europe, the 3 big engines, UK, France, and Germany in terms of the economy. Spain, we have Tony Vivas, who spoke yesterday, the engine, the enthusiasm of smart cities in Europe. Austria, that's leading the agenda in terms of research, and Holland, because they're a natural integrator. And we got the government department that thought they were in charge of the smart cities agenda in the room, sometimes more than one person, because it's difficult to figure out who actually is in charge in government. And we've spent the last 3 years having a dialogue about what is it that they are doing at a national level to drive a better functioning market for cities at a national level. A fascinating dialogue, a trusted dialogue. It's a trusted dialogue because you don't have 27 people that change all the time and don't ever agree. You have 6 nations that can actually package up where they've succeeded and, most importantly, where they've failed, and share that learning. And for me, that blueprint that has emerged from that discussion is absolutely vital as a basis to actually help those 6 nations get better, and more importantly, package that up so that that best practice can be shared across the rest of Europe and indeed beyond. So the structuring of that knowledge in a way which is political but is captured in a rational way is very, very important. And what we've now got is 8 topics which we want to actually work on as a group, as a community. It's interesting that standards is one of those boring topics that the nation states have decided is very, very important. But the other and interesting thing is how they can stimulate the market through stimulus funds and competitions. And there's some very, very successful examples of that, and I would cite Spain as a very good example of how they're actually using public grant funds to stimulate the market, to cause it to get larger, as opposed to some of the other nations where there's one winner who gets all the money, and 20 losers who get frustrated. So there's a right way and there's a wrong way for governments to act. And it's difficult, because actually understanding who is in charge of smart cities in any government is a question which I've never yet had answered. Let me take it from government level down to city level. There's no smart city without smart leadership. And here I don't mean the mayor, here I mean pan-city. So faith leaders, education leaders, industry leaders, SME communities, all of those need to get together and have a discussion where they agree that they agree. Typically, discussions are ones in cities where people think they've agreed and then discover in a number of dialogues afterwards that they have not agreed. If you think of your own city that you may live in, my guess is there's probably half a dozen different strategies. There'll be a transport strategy, there'll be a health strategy, there'll be economic development strategy. Are they all lined up to the same goal? And are they all of the same vintage? Probably not. Most of the cities that I've worked with at a city level discover that they are all pointing in slightly different directions, because the instructions have been captured on paper, typically 30 to 100 pages long, and they haven't all read each other's strategies. So you end up in a situation where there's no basis for agreement. There's a picture up there, a picture. A picture paints 1,000 words. It's possible to create something where everybody can see a simple picture and get behind that so that you get collective leadership actually driving towards the same endpoint. So excellent cities for me are cities which are well led in collaboration. That sustains beyond political terms. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. It's actually something which is coherent. It's a story that you can tell. Remember the 4 parts of the market. It's a story you can tell to society. Behind the mayor can be a picture. And behind all of the leaders of that city can be the same picture, and they can speak to that same picture. And I think these are some of the things that we need to do, because it's easier to speak to a picture and to change a picture than to change all the various different strategies that exist in a city. Now, to a different topic, that of guidance and standards, absolutely vital. The good news is that the standardization organizations are beginning to actually understand that they're not relevant to the market. Standardization organizations have been designed and built to serve the industry market. The industry market writes an awful lot of the documents, and that's wrong in the cities market. So there's a need for governments and there's a need for cities to get involved in the process of driving guidance. ISO, ITU, and IC 2 weeks ago got together in Barcelona and agreed to collaborate around actually approaching the market in the right manner. And in essence, what we're seeking to do is to write 3 different types of documents. Now, to a city mayor, to a government official, if you say standards, typically he or she will say, we've got people over there that deal with that. If you can write in 6 pages the key issues for any particular topic as a leadership guide, that's helpful. If you can write in a management framework something which actually connects across the silos of a city and the silos of government, that's helpful. So those 2 levels of documents do not really exist. And those 2 levels of documents are ones that the standardization community are now embracing and saying, we need to develop this, because the standards bodies are not relevant in the cities market. And the opportunity is to actually cause them to be relevant. So the mayor and political leaders and chief executives and leaders of cities, the managers that are trying to figure out how do we work across the various different silos of government, they're provided with materials which they can trust. Because the one thing that standards bodies have got is that they are trusted. And that's a brand, and that's important. So there's some very good news in terms of what the role of big international and national standardization bodies are doing to actually provide some useful and very specific support for cities. I'd like now to talk about, so how do we move all of that context to specifics in the market? There's an organization called Smart Cities Council. It's a global organization. It's set up initially in America, and now it's got 4 different locations in terms of regions. And the idea behind it is to really embrace that picture I showed you in terms of the market, to understand how to choreograph, how to capture structured knowledge in a way that it's useful to industry and useful to cities, and convene and bring cities together and try and time compress the time it takes between an idea and action on the ground. Typically, that's between 4 and 5 years. Typically, mayors change every 4 years. So if we can figure out how we can actually help to time compress decision-making in advance of procurement activities, we stop complaining about procurement activities and start really focusing on where it matters. The opportunity is to actually understand the value in the decision-making process up front of that. Absolutely key and vital. And what the Smart Cities Council does is to try and structure knowledge, capture knowledge, and convene these parties in these 4 different nations. Quite practical. There's a specific example, the Readiness Guide, which takes captured best practice. It's not standards that take years to develop. It's actually more tacit knowledge. And the council seeks to bring parties together to actually manage that convening process. Let me move to an example. I don't know whether, Tony, you were in a basement of a hotel in Brussels 4 years ago, but I certainly was there on a sweaty Friday afternoon. We'd had 40 or 50 people in the room, and at the end of the day, we debated this launch of the European Initiative on Smart Cities and Communities. And at the end of the day, I said, so that's great, I've really enjoyed today's discussion, but what do we do differently on Monday morning? And they all looked at me vacant, and I said, here's a crazy idea. Why don't we upgrade 1 million lampposts in European cities? And it was interesting, at the beginning of the conversation, people said, that's really stupid to talk about lampposts. They're just little pieces. You know, we want to talk about cities. And I said, yes, but the lamppost can actually be used for multiple different things. And industry were not altogether too excited. And then a chap from Barcelona said, but we've just upgraded 200 of our lampposts and putting sensors on it. We're putting public safety systems on it. And then a chap from Amsterdam said, actually, we're in the process of doing that as well. Suddenly industry said, oh, we're very interested. The point is, this is one of those very specific things that you can do. And by the way, up there it says 10 million, because a week later I thought, I wonder how many lampposts there are in European cities. I did a little bit of research and I discovered there were 60 to 90 million lampposts. For every 6 to 8 people, you've got 1 lamppost. A simple statistic for you. So we decided to change the game from 1 million to 10 million. Now that has been a 3-year personal journey of pain for me, to try and actually figure out how you can take the simplest of possible things, which is the poor, humble lamppost, and to change it from something which dogs use for a different purpose to something which is actually an asset of value in a city. And the picture shows a dozen or so different things that are nothing to do with light that a lamppost can provide. A mesh network which provides the ability to actually get connectivity that then allows the future of autonomous driving and other things to be a reality. So to think of assets in cities in a fundamentally different way. And this is the challenge that we are currently in. It saves money. If it saves money, the investment community start taking an interest in it. When we changed from 1 million, when the European Investment Bank said 1 million lampposts, that's not enough. Cities are too small, they're too risky, they're too slow. And we changed the conversation to 10 million. The first question the bank asked was, and how much money will that cost? And I said, it starts with a B for billions, not millions. Ah, we're interested now. So here is one of what I would classify as a handful of very specific things that cities can do to actually transform. Transform services with a good return on investment and offer the opportunity to make cities future-proof. And the challenge is to not have to spend 3 years batting the drum about this to accelerate that process. So reversing the message from a very specific example back to Smart Cities Council, which tries to bring the various different sectors together to accelerate pre-procurement decisions, to bring it back to a conversation which is about how city leaders can lead collectively through simplicity, visualization, and clarity, to take it back to the role of government departments to set the scene in the market around standardization, to take it back to the fact that by 2100, the world has moved down to a different place with an awful lot more people in huge cities, is our opportunity. And ladies and gentlemen, that opportunity is yours, because you are all in the position to take decisions and influence things. So I leave it with you. Thank you very much.